Having done Blink the other month, I did wonder while doing that, having mentioned more than once its crappy sequels, whether said crappy sequels would be worth reviewing, and, well, I suppose you've read the title of this video, so here we are. I suppose my overriding thought when approaching this story, and these Angel sequels in general, is that creating a sequel to Blink was both an approach that was entirely and completely understandable, and an utterly enormous mistake. Blink had been a huge success, and the Angels had become one of the most well-known monsters out of Who. During the last years of the RTD era, they had essentially become second to the Daleks as avatars of the show. Doing more with them was a completely understandable reaction, continue the hype for them and, well, continue printing money with the merch they were creating, and as their creator was taking over as the showrunner going into Series 5, it became an even more obvious thing to do. But it was a mistake, there's no doubt there, and a terrible one. One, as I said, I don't begrudge them for making, it must have been pretty irresistible. But whatever strengths they had as a monster in Blink were there because of the nature of that story, their presentation there, its structure, and indeed their place as these enigmatic and mysterious creatures. God knows there were holes in their backstory you could drive an ocean liner through, but the fundamentals were there. There was essentially only really two options for a sequel as a result: rehash Blink by going over the same beats, or expand their role and essentially kill the mystique, as that expanded role would lose much of what worked about them. Neither was a great idea, and well, they decided to go for option B, and here we are. So already, the time of Angels / Flesh and Stone was at its advantage. Combined, this would be the first continuation of the Riverstone storyline set up by Moffat in Series 4, which given the long-form nature of that story meant this would only ever be a tease that revealed little of what fans wanted. Combine it again with the fact this had to be a continuation of the series-long arc, which again is at the point where it needed to ask a lot of questions but not answer any. And combine it again with the fact this was the first story of Series 5 to be filmed, and therefore Matt Smith's first story to be filmed. And combine it again with... there's something else to combine it with. You get the idea though. This was already on the pure basis alone a bit of a hodgepodge, and I think something probably needed to give. Yes, River obviously needs to be brought back fairly early in the series so her plots could begin, but I think the question is whether it needed to be in the same story as the Angels. I think this may well be a case of biting off more than Moffat could chew. As while the story has a lot of problems, I think the biggest one is almost like a lack of focus. It feels all over the place, like there wasn't a particular idea it wanted to explore and grab onto, and that leads to a whole thing feeling like it doesn't really know what it wants to be and where it wants to go. This is an absolutely terrible story, it has things that work about it, but ultimately as a whole it just doesn't work. But then again, as I said at the start, for me this was a bad idea in the first place, and the execution in a way does reflect that. This story is only the fourth of the Moffat era, and as I said before, the first to be filmed, and I would be tempted to write off some of the problems with the story as growing pains, if I did not know that they would be the same problems that would be repeating themselves with tiring inevitability over the next 7 years. It's less an example of an era trying to find itself, and more an example of an era having decided what it wants to be, and decided, well, that's enough, thank you. Because ultimately, this is an exercise in style over substance, and well, sounds like the Moffat era does it not. Plot points ill thought out, stuff added for coolness and wow factor to create meaningless spectacle rather than interesting drama or character work. Speaking of which, confused characterization, and a reverence of characters who act like complete arseholes. So, no, to me it's not growing pains, it's pain pains. Specifically mine at having to watch Moffat era episodes. Ahem. Anyway, let's get on with it, shall we? Now, normally I start by looking at the production. And today will be no different, so let's look at the production. The director of this was famous economist and philosopher Adam Smith, or at least someone with a very similar name to him, who's one of the directors with very little Who resume to speak of, just as one production block comprising this story and the series opener at the 11th hour. That episode is a discussion for another day, so let's just focus on this one. Smith's work here has its ups and downs. As is all too common with New Who, the editing feels off, too quick in places that leads to some lines lacking any real punch. A lot of it is also way too over the top, and again, that's a fairly common complaint I have of New Who directors. But on the other hand, Smith is quite adept with visuals and a lot of the story looks great. There are some really good choices with lighting and shot placement that help give this a really good sense of scope, and almost a cinematic feel in places, which does help to give some weight to the piece that is mostly missing from the script. I like some of the choices in emphasising Amy's state of mind given what's happening to her throughout. The camera is frequently kept tight and personal to her, which helps a lot, particularly when the soldiers with her are disappearing into the cracks, which further heightens that she is now alone. So overall, yeah, a bit rough around the edges, and I do wish New Who editors would let sentences properly finish before cutting, but overall not bad at all. I'll also give this story this. The money is clearly on the screen here, as most of it looks quite good. Okay, at the start, the ancient asteroid museum that is clearly in a church somewhere in Cardiff was pretty silly, and the staging of the sudden appearance of the security guards felt like it was only just short of Devil's Gallop about to be played over it. But the rest of the story does look rather good. The locations were really well chosen as they all look great and have a great sense of scope, and the production design for the set work is mostly pretty impressive. I think this is overall a really good looking story, and as I said, that does help add a sense of scale to this, a size of what our heroes are up against really showing through, despite the script not really doing that. An element of the production that doesn't hold up for me is the music, which is not really Mr. Gold in his element to say the least. I've said before he does well with huge, bombastic, epic sounding music, which is not really what was called for here, when emphasising suspense and horror was the goal. And yeah, the music doesn't really work, it's just way too over the top, and frankly in a lot of moments kills the mood entirely with how out of place it is. A freaking trick he tries to pull is to have a kind of hiccup-like noise in the music, which just sounds funny at best and utterly scene-killingly ridiculous at worst. I'll repeat what I've said before about Gold, is that ultimately it was hurt by being the only composer for the series. If there had been others with skill sets more suited to episodes where the hits did not fit, I think it would have been more of a positive for the series overall. But yeah, it's pretty silly. Anyway, let's move on to the script. I will be fair and say there are things I do think work about this story, and I will talk about these first. I will also be honest and say most of these are conceptual things rather than anything else, as in ideas I like about the story rather than its actual execution. Now, ideas of course do matter and they're important to be given credit where it's due, but I think it probably does say a lot for my overall take on the story when that's the case. Your heart was in the right place, your brain wasn't. And yeah, that might be a simplified view of it, but ultimately I like the story a lot more in conception than I do in execution, which, given the first thing I said in the video was how much I thought it was a mistake to even make, that should probably say something. Anyway, the first thing I want to praise the story for is that it does throughout manage to deliver some quite interesting mysteries and twists. The example I'll use is the twist most of the way through the first episode that the statues we see in this cave type thing are actually angels. That's quite clever in how it's set up and revealed. And while it relies on the old perception filter cop-out to avoid the question of why these statues don't look like angels, I feel like that probably could have been naturally explained. It does make perfect sense to the viewer when it's revealed though, and also does a fantastic job of upping the stakes and the tension. Suddenly this isn't just a mission of recovery for that one angel, it's a mission of survival against a whole lot of them. It's an effective way of upping the ante and delivering a solid game changer, which, given Moffat's reputation of twists throughout his era, is a fairly welcome surprise. In fact, the whole last 10-15 minutes of the first episode is probably the strongest part of the story, and there's genuine atmosphere and tension throughout, and some of the more interesting mysteries pop up around this time. Another idea I like is that of the cliffhanger. The Doctor getting them all out of Dilly of a pickle, managing to turn on the artificial gravity of the spaceship. Well, I like this one in theory. It's a clever way of getting them out of the cliffhanger problem, certainly, and does neatly take us to the next stage of the story. It definitely sort of works with the structure in that sense. The problem is that A, it's not clear enough what the Doctor is really doing in the cliffhanger. It relies on some odd exposition and isn't edited well enough to convey what's at stake, and the shooting the ceiling is... yeah, it just doesn't really make that much sense. And B, and probably more importantly, if he's turning the artificial gravity on for something that far away, they should fall straight down to it and be splatted. Gravity doesn't give you a floating bonus if you've even just turned it on or something. What's worse is that the Doctor literally says, if it turns off while we're here, we'll be killed by the fall back down. So why weren't you killed by the initial fall onto it? But as I said, I like the idea, and that's the point of what I'm praising. It's interesting and plays into the structure in a clever way. I also like the idea of how the series' long arc is integrated into the story, with the Kraken time serving as a mean of getting rid of the red shirts, soldiers, left to guard Amy as she's going all stony on us, which again connects an idea being explored with the structure of the episode in a fairly natural and well done way. It serves as a point for the viewer to find out more about this crack stuff, in a way that very much shows and doesn't tell, serves as a way of enhancing the creepiness and horror value of the piece, and of course leads to the situation where Amy needs to be rescued by the Doctor at the end. While the series arc was fairly incoherent, I think this works because of its simplicity in presentation, and yet the eeriness it creates as a result. I should also take this opportunity to praise the performances of Matt Smith and Alex Kingston. While the former was still clearly finding his feet in the role a bit, after all, it's the first time he did it, he still gives a solid performance when given the material he clearly works best with, as would be the case throughout his run. The subtly authoritative stuff he does really well is the stuff he shines with here, and equally Kingston does very well, imbuing River with shade and subtlety to the point where her supposed motivations can shift from line to line, and it's in Kingston's excellent delivery and performance that makes it work. While the character doesn't get much from the script, her actor makes sure that the character ends up being memorable anyway. Anyway, that's what I'll say for what I do like about it. As for what I don't... let's just get it out of the way. The angels are really poorly done by here. Now, as I said, this was an uphill battle to begin with, because the idea of a sequel to Blink was just a bad one. As I said, the Angels succeeded as monsters despite not really making much sense, because of how they were mysterious, unique, and fitted perfectly within the structure set up for them in that episode. Bringing them into a larger story of a larger scope was just setting up to ruin what was unique about them, because there's simply no way that kind of monster, the subtle, unmoving statues that kill by sending back in time, is ever going to work in what is essentially Doctor Who does Aliens. But as I said at the start, the only other alternative was just rehashing Blink, the same small scope and the same kind of ideas. So it was a bind I think they probably just should have been avoided full stop, but here we are, an Angel sequel, and it just doesn't work at all. The stuff that didn't work about them in Blink, all the stuff that made absolutely no sense, that's all still here. For instance, they are just stones when they are being observed. So why don't the soldiers, when they're being attacked while the Doctor tries to open the door at the beginning of the second episode, just shoot them? I'm pretty sure a stone statue would not hold up amazingly against sustained machine gun fire because, work with me on this, stone is not titanium, as I said in the Blink review. And again, when Amy is stuck not blinking at the Angel, just wink, you moron! An Angel sequel I could have appreciated would try to answer some of these questions, including the important ones about what their genesis is and why they are what they are. And as I said in the Blink review, not answering every question, not going all exposition-y and telling us everything, just keep the mystery in place, but just make it a bit more likely that they actually make a lick of bloody sense. But nothing is answered, all of the same stuff on Blink still makes no sense. And lucky old us, we get even more that makes no sense, but this time it's less about the logic of it and more about, well, the fact that Stephen Moffat likes to throw things into the scripts that he thinks are cool regardless of how much sense they make or whether he actually, is fucking going anywhere with them. This means that the presentation of the Angels in this story is just so totally departs from how they were in Blink. It ultimately means for me that they just lose any of their uniqueness. He couldn't just leave well enough alone, and now he's added all this stuff to the Angels that he thought sounded cool, but just completely strips them of what made them interesting. Now, to start with, what made them effective with Blink was that they were not like traditional monsters at all. They were just silent, motionless statues. And they didn't kill by attacking, simply by sending someone back in time in an instant, to the point where there wasn't even an effect by doing it. And in this story, oh, they now move all the time. I mean, wow, we see them move a lot for a species we shouldn't be able to see move at all. Which, the whole point is that they don't move when they're being observed. It feels like that point might have been lost a bit, does it not? And worst, they are moving while still in the stone statue form. We directly see this at least once and probably more. I don't remember and can't be asked to check. And this directly contradicts Blink, where it was clearly established that they are stone when they are observed, and not at other times. They're not stone statues that can happen to move under certain conditions. They just turn to stone when they're being observed. Anyway, and also, they're not silent anymore, thanks to the Angel Bob interactions. That element is completely gone, and we get to hear them as we do with any other monster, and find out, yeah, they're just sort of generic baddies, and that's about it. So, great. The idea of not knowing what these monsters were saying, that's gone and replaced by generic nothings. Thanks, Moffat. Oh, and at one point we hear them making weird alien sounds that we're told is them laughing, which I just can't believe anyone thought that was a good idea. Generic, monster-like sounds for them to be laughing. Yeah, any uniqueness they had then is well down the toilet at this point, I'm afraid. Oh, and they no longer kill by sending them back in time, that interesting angle that led to some interesting human drama in Blink. No, that's all gone. They now just snap necks. Despite the fact they can't move when they're observed, so not really sure how that works, but yeah, they're going around snapping everyone's necks. Again, a unique element of these monsters from their first episode completely gone and completely wasted. Indeed, the whole reason Don't Blink was even a thing was to escape that sudden touch of being sent back in time, which is completely lost with this new snappy approach. I'm not sure what approach could have been done to making a successful Angel sequel, but removing all that made them unique and interesting in their first episode while fixing none of those logical problems, maybe not what I'd have done. And as for the stuff that's added, well, this is where the whole adding stuff without thinking about it bit comes back in. For a start, some of these abilities are told to us through a random book that River has, implied or maybe not to be written by a future Doctor, frankly I don't care enough, which basically tells us these abilities out loud through exposition. I do love tell and not show, don't you? And anyway, one of them is the frankly ridiculous, the image of an angel becomes an angel. What? How? What? How the fuck does that work? Now, admittedly, there was already a lot of logical hiccups with these things, as I've mentioned, but this is just on a completely different level, to be honest. An image of an angel can become an angel through magic, as close as I can guess, because there is no universe in which I is ever going to make anything close to a fucking lick of sense. What mechanism is it using to do this? What skill to basically transport one's entire being through a camera screen does this thing have? Now, I wouldn't mind it quite as much if there was some time dedicated to it, because this is the other problem with this. This insane ability, which makes about as much sense as these angels being able to pull psychic parasite powers out of their asses, comes up once. In the beginning, in order for the trapped angel to infect Amy with its psychic parasite powers. Oh, you thought I was making that up? Oh, you poor soul. And that's it! That's the only time it's used! It might as well not have even been there. Amy simply could have been infected by actually running into the angel at some point once they actually entered the cave type thing, whatever. It's set up extremely poorly by exposition, kills the pacing of the first episode by having us spend the best part of 10 minutes on this tedious crap, does not make a lick of fucking sense, and then doesn't come up again! This is the Moffat era, people. Anyway, as for the psychic parasite powers, yeah, apparently angels, if you stare at it too long, can infect your brain and have an angel take it over. Right. Now, while this is idiotic and makes no sense, and again, that's because, I have to emphasise this, Blink established, when you are looking at them, it is just a stone. Again, Blink established this very definitively. It has no psychic parasite powers when you're looking at it, because it's just a bloody stone. Despite that, it nevertheless has a bit of potential, because it's what sets up Amy's arc for the episode, which we'll get to in a bit. The problem is that it just doesn't escape making no sense. As an example, another example of how stupid it is, Amy stops her transformation into an angel by closing her eyes. Yeah, that apparently stops it because it's in her eye, and closing it would stop it getting out of her eye? Huh? Ultimately, I don't think it's worth it, and what we learn about the angels as a result. We don't get enough about them in terms of what their motivations are and stuff like that. I mean, I'd rather not have that at all, because that's not what made them effective the first time around, but we don't even get that payoff for it. It's just no depth at all. It feels like it's just been thrown in because it's cool, and well, Moffat has a track record there, doesn't he? Similarly, the angel being able to reanimate Bob just feels like a cheap pulled out the arse ability because it fits the plot. Sure, they can reanimate corpses to talk through, because God knows having an enemy that's entirely silent we can only guess the motivations of would be far too effective and creepy. Now, I'll give a bit of credit, this is at least a good motivator for the Doctor and gives Smith some great angry material to work with, but this could have been achieved in other ways without turning the angels into such generic villains. And that's the problem in a nutshell. There's nothing here that really plays into what they were in Blink, and they just thus become generic monsters instead. It's a waste of an interesting enemy, and ultimately, I think this doomed them. People got bored of this approach quickly, and the angels dropped off the monster tier list to the point where they're probably below a lot of older staples like the Ice Warriors or Silurians. Whereas when this episode was broadcast, they were miles ahead of them. Again, they were really probably second behind the Daleks at this point. So ultimately, I think the potential of Blink is lost here. This probably killed the angels as a villain stone dead, haha, by just removing all that made them unique. Anyway, let's, as I said, talk about Amy's arc. Now, Amy as a character is not going to be something I'll dwell on here, as there'll be other opportunities to do so. Let's just say I'm not going to speak at length about how she is a terrible girlfriend, and her behaviour in the epilogue of this story is so utterly shocking it almost makes me wish we had Clara. Almost. But that's not what I'm going to talk about. Instead, I'm going to talk about her arc throughout the episode. As I said, in the first episode, she gets infected by the angel and quickly starts exhibiting gotten angel in her head symptoms. Now, this does have a few good moments. The bit when she believes her hand is stone and the Doctor has to convince her it's just in her head is a fantastic moment, particularly for Smith, as he shows how quick thinking this Doctor is and how able he is to wrangle his way out of these situations. I also think this shows how this bit could have worked really well. I think it just should have been entirely in her head. And the story she has here is trying to deal with this insidious threat that she only thinks is threatening her when it's not able to do anything. But she can't be convinced of that because of how convincing it is for her. That would make far more sense, the angel simply being able to project that feeling of paranoia and fear onto her. That's a lot more plausible than able to grow a new angel in her eye, and I think will allow the same beats to be hit and probably do so a lot more effectively. But even as it is, some of it does work. Amy's descent into total vulnerability and helplessness does fit fairly naturally in with the plot and leads to some interesting stuff, as I mentioned with the cracking time and the red shirts disappearing. But ultimately, I don't think it does enough with Amy's character to really make this work. I don't get the sense this brash and confident companion comes face to face with the realities of the danger of TARDIS travel and sort of breaks under it. It's clearly what they were going for, but Amy wasn't really well defined enough beforehand. What's happening to her is too nonsensical to really hit home, and ultimately I don't think enough is done with it. Surely Amy is scared about it, yeah, we get that, but what does that say about her? What does that say about anyone else? I mean, yeah, sure, the Doctor is angry and determined to save her, but that happening when a companion is in danger is not exactly breaking new ground, it's to be expected. I'm not sure this has enough meat on the bones to really work, despite a few moments that do actually kind of work. Karen Gillan's performance as Amy in this is mixed. I think it clearly shows this was the first time she was playing the character, as there are moments it definitely feels like she doesn't have a grip on what she's doing with it. Her delivery is sometimes very off, and yeah, she's getting a feel for the role, it's to be expected. And on the flip side, she does have a few nice subtle moments as well, so yeah, ultimately I just feel like her storyline doesn't really work, despite some interesting efforts. As for the Doctor, I don't feel he gets too much here. Smith does his best in imbuing a bit of subtlety into the performance, which is nice, and he does get quite a few heroic moments to show the capabilities of this Doctor in an effective way. I also think his anger at the Angels throughout is fairly effective, but in terms of character establishments, there's not much. His relationship with River is also pretty confused and therefore not terribly effective, but that's to be expected given how her story is structured. Ultimately, I think this probably isn't what you'd be looking for from a story that should be establishing a new Doctor's character, but ultimately I think it's a symptom of the overall problems they had with the 11th Doctor's character, but they never really quite worked out what they wanted him to be and what they wanted to do with him, and you sort of see that here. The awful humour, which I'll get to, don't you worry, clearly shows they were trying to shoehorn in pretend clone the higher-ups wanted, and it bears repeating, talking quickly is not humour or character. But then you also get the darker moments to show the more Troughton-esque performance that Smith wanted to do. It's sadly a bit of a mess, despite a few shining moments. And then there's River. The wider discussion around this character is very much for another day, and given I have enough arcs I'm looking at presently, and it's unlikely I'll get there anytime soon, but ultimately I don't think this story is all that important for her. Bringing her back early in the series to set up her use in the finale and to restart the story as it left off in the library story back in Series 4, yeah, that was probably necessary. As I said, Kingston gives a fine performance that helps justify the character, but ultimately I think combining her with the Angel stuff doesn't really give either enough room to breathe. In the end, there's no real development for her story. She does her fancy and plausible escape, meets up with Sir Jorah, who she may or may not be hooking up with, but she also might be killing the Doctor later on and has like vague, mysterious secrets to hide. It's just sort of all exposition-y and not really any bite. Now, I get a lot of it is set up for later stuff, but that leads into the other problem. But it's a setup for stuff that just didn't really turn out this way. This feels like this is leading into a story separate from the one we actually ended up getting for River. That Moffat changed his mind on certain things, or more likely simply didn't have it in any way mapped out as he started. It just feels clunky and out of place, like none of this really matters anyway, so who cares? As I said, I don't really think there's enough character stuff between her and the Doctor, considering that's pretty much the point of her character. I'd say that's a major problem. I mean, compare this with her final appearance in the Moffat era and Husbands of River Song, and, well, the difference is night and day. And that was with a Doctor she only met at one time, whereas she was supposed to be setting up a long-term character dynamic with Smith's Doctor here. There's stuff that works about the character here. She has moments where she shows her cunning and her intelligence, and her nature does lend itself to a bit of mystery. Can you really trust her and all that? But ultimately, I think most of that, what that does work is down to Kingston rather than the script. It just doesn't really pan out. And then there's the Red Shirt Army under the command of Sir Jorah. Now, this lot are pretty generic special forces type army lot who are there to go into the lair of the enemy and get themselves ceremoniously killed by one, and you can pretty much guess when each of them is going to end up getting binned. They're all the cardboard cutouts you expect, and the only time they're even particularly notable is when Bob, who, despite some exposition, has no character, don't let the episode fool you into that, becomes the voice of the Angels, and when the remaining lot of them guarding Amy disappear into the crack. None of that's to do with any of their characters or anything like that, it's just generic soldiering and that's it. The only more notable one is their leader, Octavian, who you might have guessed from what I called him just a moment ago, is played by Ian Glenn, who played Sir Jorah in Game of Thrones. Look, he gave a great performance as Sir Jorah, so I don't think I'm saying he isn't a really good actor, but he's just plain bad in this. His dialogue seems so wooden and stilted. Now, the script does not help him, given there's nothing to the character. He's a generic, you got my men killed, type leader, who may or may not have a thing with River, but since they have zero chemistry and she barely reacts when she learns he's dead, who even gives a shit? The only more notable thing about this entire lot is that, bizarrely, they're apparently some kind of church, and they're like all priests and stuff, despite obviously being soldiers. Now, I did wonder where this was going the first time I heard it, and was not entirely surprised to discover at the end of the story that it was going absolutely fucking nowhere. Apart from a few lines, it's just not relevant at all. You could have easily cut those lines, they just act like generic soldiers, and they are generic soldiers. The whole church thing never comes into it. And yes, before you start, I know, this is setting up stuff for later arcs, but A, that stuff isn't exactly impressive either, and B, if you can't do anything actually with it in this story, then it shouldn't be here. Set it up later on when you actually have something to do with it. Just saying these people are part of a church when they're obviously soldiers and have doing nothing with that is pointless. Imagine if we were watching the first episode of Earthshock, for instance, and one of the soldiers in that said, oh, by the way, we're actually with, say, the Department for Business and Trade. And it never comes up again in that story, except it turns out that the Department for Business and Trade are the ones running the space station in Resurrection of the Daleks. That would be a pretty pathetic link, and would just be a bizarre and distracting addition. So yeah, that's pretty stupid. Anyway, a couple more things before we wrap up. I want to talk about the structure of this story, which is also quite bad. For a start, the pacing is poor. It feels nothing like really happens in the first half an hour of the first episode actually matters. It's mostly dominated by River's irrelevant escape and then the angel infecting Amy scene, which, as I believe I mentioned, makes no sense and is pretty tedious. As I said earlier, things do pick up in the later parts of the episode, but the second one is just a mess. It feels pretty stop-start and never manages to set a consistent level throughout. The plot structure also doesn't work, even ignoring a lot of the holes. So much is just convenience explained through exposition and the like. The ending, for instance. After all that build-up, the relentless advance of the angels, all the stuff with Amy, suddenly we're explained the real reason behind the plot by the angel, and the Doctor saves the day on the basis of a plot point explained more or less in exactly the same breath. And obviously Amy is completely saved by it as well. It's just pretty haphazard, but God forbid we take a bit longer to sort out, because then otherwise we couldn't spend 5 minutes of the epilogue of Amy being a terrible person and a really shit girlfriend or fiancé or wife, whatever the fuck she is at this point, I don't remember or care. As well as the structural issues, the usual Moffat era stuff you expect here. Cringy, weak dialogue, massive tonal issues, combined with a weak humour. If drama and horror is what you're going for, then perhaps don't include your usual shit jokes to completely kill any tension. Oh, the worst offender of the humour category though is early on in the story, with this scene.
But it did make the noise.
What noise?
You know, the...
It's not supposed to make that noise. You leave the brakes on.
Okay, first of all, this is not funny. What is the joke? River is better than the Doctor at stuff, which is funny because... I'll get back to you on that. Secondly, and I can't believe I even have to say this, there are so many fucking instances of other TARDISes making that noise throughout the show's run, it's honestly just kind of sad. And Moffat is a fan. He knows that just as well as I do, which means he is deliberately ignoring all of it just for the sake of that shit joke. So, what you're saying is, the Monk, the Master, the Rani, God knows how many other Time Lords who appeared throughout the series, they all left the brakes on as well, did they? What do you mean brakes? It's a fucking time machine, not a Nissan Micra. What, does it have a handbrake you leave so it doesn't float off into the time and space continuum? Now, you may be tempted to defend this idiocy with, but she was joking, to which I say, why didn't the TARDIS make the noise then? If she was joking, how did it manage to land without making the noise that TARDISes always make when they land? I'll wait. So yeah, that's the standard humour we get. Stuff that directly contradicts well-established lore for jokes that are not funny and tells us nothing about the characters involved. Thanks as always, Moffat. Anyway, look, I'm not going to tell you this is an awful story. Ultimately it's bad stuff, but it's just bad. It's not insulting or angering or anything like that. It's just pretty unimpressive, and doesn't do much to make up for it. Ultimately, I don't think it justifies the idea of an Angel sequel at all, and it's difficult not to get the impression that he should have just left well alone. Because, well, as I said earlier, this was the point where Angel stock began to plummet very quickly, to the point where they at one point looked like they were going to be relegated to spin-off villains, before that spin-off was cancelled, but never mind. Obviously they did return in the Chibnall era, but that's what the thing that gets me about this. Not every monster needs to return. Several classic monsters were beloved despite appearing only once. There was the Toymaker, the Macra, the Axons, the Daemons, the Drashigs, the Wirrn, the Zygons, Sutek, the Crinoids, the Robots, the Rutons, to name but a few. They were all well-loved enemies, some of whom even seeped beyond Doctor Who fandom into popular culture, and they all only appeared once in the classic series. Was there really a pressing need for more Angels? Could we have not gone without? In the end, I think the story proves we probably could. Yeah, I get it, it was probably irresistible, but there was still a good reason to leave well enough alone. Final score for this story is 4 out of 10. I'd say it's slightly below average for New Who. It's not totally without merit, a few good ideas and some good performances, but it's let down by poor plotting and character work, confused execution of said ideas, a ridiculous number of gaping holes in the story, and the turning of their unique villain into a generic baddie that all works against this story. It's not awful, but it's not good, and ultimately I think Moffat bit off more than he could chew with this. There's too much going on, and it doesn't really focus on anything in particular to try and justify it. And ultimately, I do think the Angels themselves are the weak link in proceedings. Well, surely this would be the thing that would convince Moffat to leave alone? Ha ha ha, no. They would turn up again at the end of Amy's time on the show, and we'll get to that at some point. Not sure when, I've got a lot on the plate coming up, so next time, in 2 weeks, we're back to the Classic Who, and specifically we'll look at the history of the show's lore with the Deadly Assassin. Correct Gallifreyan house robes not included.